By early 1945, with the failure of the Ardennes offensive in the west and the massive Soviet offensive in the east, time was clearly running out for Nazi Germany, a fact that was becoming obvious to many of her leaders. Hitler remained convinced that the war could still end favourably for Germany, but he was becoming an increasingly isolated and physically degenerated figure who believed his own propaganda. It was true that the German army and the Waffen-SS were performing miracles in attempting to hold the western and eastern fronts, not to mention Italy as well. But with the German economy collapsing under the weight of heavy Allied bombing, and with too few well-trained soldiers and sufficient armoured vehicles, and most importantly fuel, the attrition was unsustainable. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS and the police, was by 1945 unquestionably the second most powerful man in Germany after Hitler. The SS he had built up was all-powerful, controlling a 900,000-strong army, the Waffen-SS, and a huge system of concentration and labour camps, and many industrial enterprises, making the SS a state within a state. Himmler had benefited greatly in the aftermath of the July 1944 bomb plot against Hitler, allowing him to extend his influence over the regular army, whose generals were now held in suspicion by the Führer, and Himmler used the roundups that followed the bomb to remove many of his remaining opponents. But Himmler had been stupidly promoted to field command by Hitler, leading first to his incompetent handling of the situation in the Vosges Mountains against US and French troops in the winter of 1944-45, and then command of Army Group Vistula to halt the Soviet offensive into Pomerania in early 1945. Himmler was eventually relieved of his command on the 20th of March, and these failures drove a wedge between Himmler and Hitler, so much so that Himmler decided to take action to end the war without recourse to Hitler. His intention was to negotiate a peace settlement with the Western powers, that is the United States, Great Britain and France, allowing Germany to concentrate all her forces on stopping the Soviets, and in the process making Himmler the leader of Germany. Himmler had access to Germany's best secret intelligence organizations and information, but he chose as his peace envoy his beloved and trusted masseur, Felix Kersten, a Baltic German physical therapist, whom Himmler had come to rely upon to cure his stomach cramps caused by stress and anxiety. A society figure with a list of influential European patients, Kersten had already acted as Himmler's special envoy before. In August 1942, Kersten had helped organize Himmler's visit to Finland and was completely trusted. Himmler began peace negotiations, knowing full well that he couldn't inform Hitler of what he was doing. Hitler was firmly welded to fighting to the bitter end, and some historians have suggested that Himmler may have been seeking to eventually supplant Hitler as leader, as the Führer continued to deteriorate physically. And if any man could have toppled Hitler from within the inner circle, Himmler was probably best placed with the men and resources at his disposal. Himmler's first step was in reaching out to the Allies via neutral Sweden. Kersten was already in Stockholm and approached Count Volker Bernadotte, an aristocrat and a head of the Swedish Red Cross. Bernadotte had organized prisoner exchanges in 1943 and 44, whereby 11,000 Allied POWs were brought out of Germany via Sweden. He had a good working relationship with both sides. Himmler entered into a correspondence with Bernadotte, and Himmler sent his spymaster, SS Brigadeführer Walter Schellenberg, to Stockholm for face-to-face meetings. Himmler realized that he had some leverage with the Nordic nations, and could possibly earn some goodwill from the Western Allies by using some of the concentration camp prisoners as pawns in this game. By now Himmler was indeed playing a dangerous game. On the 20th of April 1945, he duly turned up at Hitler's last birthday celebration at the Reichschancellery in Berlin, a heavily bombed mess by this stage. That same day, Soviet spearheads reached the city's eastern suburbs and opened fire with artillery. To Hitler's face, Himmler swore complete allegiance before leaving Berlin as soon as he could, going north for a meeting the following day at Kersten's country estate at Harzwalde, 70 kilometers north of the capital. The previous day, Norbert Mazur, Swedish representative of the World Jewish Congress, had been flown from Stockholm to Tempelhof Airport in Berlin. The trip arranged by Kersten. Mazur was then driven to Harzwalde to await the arrival of Himmler and Schellenberg. Himmler arrived at the estate at 2:30 a.m. on the 21st of April and had a rather bizarre 2.5-hour meeting with Mazur, an extraordinary meeting between two dread enemies. Himmler tried to justify the Holocaust to Mazur and even told him, "I want to bury the hatchet between us and the Jews. If I had had my own way, many things would have been done differently." Himmler also told Mazur, who would inform Bernadotte and the Allies, waiting and watching behind him, that he was the Nazi leader the Western Allies should be talking to. He even wanted the Allies to set aside the final solution and move on. To us today, Himmler appears completely deluded, but his utterances demonstrate both his ruthlessness and lack of empathy for the victims of his policies, and his self-belief that he was the only man capable of saving Germany at this stage in the war. As an act of what Himmler perceived as goodwill, he ordered the release of 20,000 concentration camp inmates, many of them Scandinavians, and permitted their safe transport on the so-called white buses to Sweden. On the 23rd of April, Himmler had his first face-to-face meeting with Count Bernadotte when he went to the Swedish consulate in Lübeck in northern Germany. This meeting was critical. Himmler believed that he had established his good faith by permitting the White Buses operation to go ahead, and now he told Bernadotte that Hitler, in a burning Berlin being encircled by powerful Soviet armies, would probably be dead in 2 to 3 days. Himmler stated that he was basically the leader in waiting. Officially, according to the 1941 Law of Succession, drawn up following Rudolf Hesse's flight to Britain, Hitler's successor was Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, the corpulent, drug-addled, and by now sidelined and disgraced head of the Air Force. It appeared unlikely that someone with Himmler's power would have agreed to serve under Göring as Führer. Therefore, Himmler asked Bernadotte to contact the Allied Supreme Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, and tell him that Germany was prepared, under Himmler's leadership and with Himmler's SS and police keeping order, to surrender to the Western Allies, but only the Western Allies. There could be no surrender to the Soviet Union. Bernadotte suggested that Himmler write a letter to Eisenhower setting out these proposals. Of course, Himmler was now committing his treason to paper. The problem was the Allies had agreed among themselves that no one nation could accept a German surrender or partial surrender. Germany had to surrender unconditionally to all of the Allies. So if Roosevelt and Churchill had accepted Himmler's proposal, which they never did, and accepted a ceasefire and surrender of Germany's Western armies, it would have led to an immediate crisis with Stalin, and perhaps even war between the Allies. Himmler knew from long experience that the Western Allies didn't trust Stalin and were concerned by how much Europe he would swallow up before Germany's final capitulation, but Roosevelt and Churchill remained firm on the point of unconditional German surrender. Himmler was also deluding himself if he thought that the Western Allies wanted to deal with him or allow him to become the de facto leader of Germany. The Holocaust and German occupation policies throughout Europe, much of it stemming from Himmler's SS and Gestapo, ensured that Himmler was labelled as a major criminal to be found and punished once Germany surrendered. But things were happening beyond Himmler's control. The same day that Himmler met Bernadotte in Lübeck, Hermann Göring precipitated a leadership crisis in Berlin. Göring had also left Berlin on the 20th of April, following Hitler's birthday and a military conference in the Führerbunker. He had made arrangements to have trainloads of art and antiques, much of it looted from private collections, shipped south from his huge estate Currenhal near Berlin to the relative safety of Obersalzberg near Berchtesgaden in southern Bavaria, where Göring also maintained a house next to Hitler's Berghof. In Berlin, Hitler suffered a breakdown during a military situation conference in the bunker, and after calming down announced that the war was lost. Luftwaffe officers at the meeting reported to Göring that Hitler had broken and reneged all responsibility towards army and state. Göring was encouraged to send a telegram to Hitler asking him for permission to assume the leadership of the Reich. But Hitler recovered from his momentary lapse, and his sinister private secretary and minister without portfolio, Martin Bormann, intercepted the cable and spun it to Hitler as an attempt by Göring to seize power, in effect a coup. Hitler ordered Göring's arrest and stripped him of all his positions, removing him from the line of succession. However, though Göring's disgrace had cleared him out of the way of Himmler's succession, who would probably have been Hitler's natural choice under the circumstances, Himmler's overtures to Eisenhower were rebuffed. On the 26th of April, General Schellenberg was informed by Count Löwenhaupt, the Swedish legation at Lübeck, that Himmler's offer to surrender troops in Western Europe to the Allies had not been well received, specifically because Himmler was unacceptable to the Western powers as a person with whom discussions could be undertaken. Schellenberg did not inform Himmler of this development. Himmler had already dispatched a U.S. Army Air Force general the Germans had captured earlier in the war named Vanneman on the 24th of April to Switzerland, bearing a formal offer of German capitulation from Himmler to Eisenhower. On the 27th of April, Himmler breakfasted with Schellenberg and Count Bernadotte at Apenrode, and he expressed again his desire for some limited accord with the Allies, where he could still play a part. But Himmler's secret scheme was now leaked to the press, and the Western powers very publicly dismissed Himmler's peace offer, effectively ending his ambition to hang on to some high office after Hitler's demise. That same day, Himmler's SS liaison at the bunker, Gruppenführer Hermann Fegelein, went absent without leave, and was discovered naked, drunk, and in the company of his mistress in his Berlin apartment, with a suitcase full of civilian clothes packed. Hitler's bodyguards bundled him back to the bunker, where Bormann pressured Hitler to have him shot. The proverbial hit the fan on the evening of the 28th of April, when BBC Radio broadcast a Reuters press report all about Himmler's secret peace negotiations, this being picked up in the bunker by a gleeful Bormann. When Hitler was presented with evidence of the Reichsführer's disloyalty, he went berserk. Himmler was declared a traitor, relieved of all his officers and ordered arrested. The hapless Fegelein was marched outside and shot. When Hitler gave these orders, Soviet troops were only 300 yards from the bunker. The following day, Hitler confirmed Göring and Himmler's expulsion from the Nazi Party and dismissal from all officers, and named his successor as Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, then headquartered at Flensburg in the north of Germany. Himmler, however, was not arrested, despite Hitler's order. He moved with Schellenberg, his adjutants, personal staff and bodyguard battalion to Kalkhorst, establishing a new SS headquarters there. Here he contemplated his next moves. Hitler killed himself on the 30th of April, and Dönitz succeeded as planned. Some of Himmler's subordinates pressed him to use his remaining men and take over Dönitz's new government. But Himmler was unsure and hesitant. He decided to use Schellenberg to continue negotiations with the Allies via Sweden and also through Grand Admiral Dönitz. Himmler wanted to be appointed a minister in the new government, and he did have some influence over Dönitz. It was Himmler who convinced Dönitz to replace Joachim von Ribbentrop as Nazi foreign minister. Von Ribbentrop, his career at an end and fearing capture, scuttled off to Hamburg and went into hiding. He was eventually apprehended by a British Army snatch squad some weeks after the city had been captured, shacked up in a grimy flat with a half-naked young woman. Himmler remained an important figure at Dönitz's new headquarters. The impression given of Himmler as a meek, confused and cowardly individual begging Dönitz for a new role and then being rebuffed is inaccurate. In fact, Dönitz actually appointed Himmler commander of all remaining German armed forces in northern Germany, Denmark and Norway. When Dönitz received Bormann's message from the Führerbunker ordering him to arrest Himmler as a traitor, Dönitz had actually been in a meeting with the Reichsführer discussing the imminent fall of Hamburg to the British. Instead of arresting him, Dönitz continued with the meeting. The following day, Himmler went to Dönitz's headquarters and had lunch with the Grand Admiral. According to his mistress, Hedwig Potthast, Himmler hired rooms in Lübeck for her, and Himmler came to stay with her. This is in despite of the accepted history that Himmler was preparing to move south. But at some point, the pretense that Himmler would be able to obtain a position in Dönitz's government became clear. On the 6th of May 1945, only hours before the end of the war in Europe, Dönitz informed Himmler that according to Hitler's last will and testament, a copy having now reached him, Himmler was dismissed from all offices of state forthwith. He was no longer Reichsführer SS, head of the German police, or commander-in-chief of the reserve army. He was finished. Himmler apparently was castigated by the new Nazi Minister of the Interior, Count Schwerin von Krosigk, when he told him bluntly, "You should drive straight to Montgomery's headquarters and say you are Heinrich Himmler and that you want to take full responsibility for everything the SS has done." At this point, having exhausted all possible avenues as a peacemaker and latterly as a prospective minister in the new government, Himmler was left with two viable options: surrender himself to the Allies and face trial as a major war criminal and, of course, inevitable execution, or go into hiding. He chose the latter course. When Count von Krosigk told Himmler to drive to Montgomery's headquarters and take responsibility for the crimes of his SS, Himmler apparently turned white, said nothing in reply, and left Dönitz's headquarters, never to return. He evidently realized on the 6th of May 1945 that his power was at an end. But he didn't flee into hiding, at least not yet. Though the SS state functioned right up to the end of the war, Himmler didn't have his personal planes standing by to fly him to Sweden, Spain, Antarctica, or the moon. Rather, he moved to a requisitioned farmhouse at Zattrup. At this point, Himmler released his guard unit, which made itself scarce, and was left with a handful of trusted officers and men from his personal staff who were all in the same position as their leader. With Himmler at Zattrup were 5 principal SS officers: his personal administrative officer, Standartenführer Dr. Rudolf Brandt, his personal doctor, Gruppenführer Dr. Karl Gebhardt, SS Brigadeführer Otto Ohlendorf, a major war criminal, his personal aide, Sturmbannführer Josef Kiermeier, and his 2 adjutants, Obersturmbannführer Werner Grothmann and Sturmbannführer Heinz Macher. There were also present about 10 other SS men, 7 of whom were NCOs. This group of perhaps 16 men, including Himmler, still had 4 large field cars at its disposal and plenty of weapons. According to established histories, Himmler now determined to go to Bavaria. According to Count von Krosigk, Himmler had previously stated to him sometime in early May the following regarding the Allies: "They will never discover me. Political developments are going to be in my favor. I shall go into hiding to await them." We will deal with Himmler's movements on the run in a future video, but it certainly appears the case that Himmler still sought some future role in Germany, and his stated aim was to lie low and then re-emerge once the political situation was favorable. He didn't appear to be interested in escaping from Germany. He was close to neutral Sweden, yet gathered his loyalists to go south through the entire length of Germany under Allied military control to Bavaria, when he could still have fled with relative ease north to a neutral nation. Himmler the peacemaker was now Himmler the fugitive, but Himmler remained in the game and a wily and resourceful opponent at this stage. The Reichsführer SS was in a tricky situation. He had exhausted avenues with both the Allies, who wanted nothing to do with him, and Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz' new Nazi government in northern Germany, who eventually dismissed him from his offices of state on the 6th of May 1945, following Hitler's earlier instructions. Himmler had drastically reduced his entourage from several hundred officers and men to only 14 faithful officers and NCOs. Since the 6th of May, Himmler and this group were staying at a farmhouse in Antwerp, and Himmler announced his intention to go south to Bavaria. The obvious question is, why? In the previous video we saw that Himmler had plenty of opportunities to flee to neutral Sweden, but did not go. To travel south throughout Germany was extremely risky. Though the country was in an uproar with millions of displaced civilians and demobilized German soldiers wandering about, British and US troops were starting to exercise control over their territories, and Allied patrols and checkpoints were everywhere. One of their purposes was the identification and apprehension of persons of interest to the new occupiers, and Himmler was at the top of that long list. Whilst at Antwerp, Himmler and his remaining followers changed their appearances. Primarily this meant removing all insignia from their uniforms and obtaining false documentation. All of them, including Himmler, would pretend to be recently demobilized German secret field police, Geheime Feldpolizei, Himmler himself carrying papers that identified him as Sergeant Heinrich Himmler, lately of a special armoured company attached to the secret field police, demobilized on the 3rd of May 1945. The collective story was that the group were ill and making their way back home, just another 15 German soldiers among millions roving the highways and byways of recently surrendered Germany. Himmler also altered his physical appearance, as he was the most recognizable among the group due to the many hours of wartime newsreel appearances, thousands of photographs and public speeches. He shaved off his moustache and wore a black eye patch over his left eye. The choice of a secret field police unit was, on the surface, actually quite a good one. Such units were often staffed by middle-aged soldiers, many unfit due to war wounds or illnesses. Himmler was 44 years old at the time, and several others in the group were also middle-aged. Any Allied troops should have dismissed such a shambolic group as unimportant after a cursory glance at their papers. But the group had made a mistake. They didn't know that members of the secret field police were subject to immediate arrest by the Allies, including NCOs. This was because the secret field police was part of the Sicherheitsdienst, the SD, the SS security police. Himmler's cover name, Heinrich Himmler, was not made up. Himmler was a real person, a rural policeman tried and sentenced to death for defeatism some months before. His papers had been in the possession of the Gestapo and appropriated for Himmler's use, as Himmler apparently bore a strong resemblance to the Reichsfuhrer. All this suggests that Himmler had been making preparations for just such an eventuality for some weeks or months. Himmler made his move south on the 10th of May 1945, 2 days after the German surrender. The 15 men, undoubtedly well armed with pistols and machine guns, used 4 large Wanderer W11 field cars, much favoured by Himmler during his earlier visits to the front. The next day, the group arrived in the small village of Delver, a few miles southeast of Friedrichstadt on the Eider River. The next day, the convoy arrived at Marne. It had taken, due to the confusion on the roads caused by refugees, German troops and destroyed vehicles, 2 days to travel a mere 60 miles south. They were now stuck on the north bank of the Elbe River estuary, with no way to move the cars over. Instead, the 4 big field cars were abandoned, and the group walked down to the riverbank at Brunsbüttel. After some searching and negotiations, Himmler's party paid a fisherman 500 Reichsmarks to ferry them across the river to the town of Neuhaus, at the mouth of the Oster River. From now on, Himmler's party would be on foot. Whatever plan the Reichsfuhrer or any other member of the party had is not known, but they continued south. For another 5 days, Himmler's party trudged along country lanes, sleeping in farms, barns, or even beside the road, becoming increasingly dirty and dishevelled, footsore and exhausted. By the 18th of May, the group reached Bremerwörde, a small town on the river Oster. The plan was to walk through the open countryside to avoid getting tangled up in the towns and villages between Hamburg and Bremerhaven, which were both under full British occupation. On the 18th of May, the group moved into a farmhouse on Waldstrasse in Bremerwerder, the owners having no idea at the time of the identification of the men. SS Sturmbannführer Kiermaier, Himmler's personal aide, went forward to investigate the Oster River Bridge, which was guarded by British troops. For 2 days, Kiermaier tried to obtain special movement passes from the local mayor, the Landrat, who had been appointed to a new administration under British authority. He wanted chits of paper allowing the group to pass through the checkpoint for some manufactured reason, such as a group of sick German troops returning home to Munich. But the Landrat, probably realizing that Kiermaier represented some group of Nazi fugitives, and probably not keen on antagonizing his new masters, refused all entreaties. Himmler's group hung around at the farmhouse from the 18th to the 21st of May before a decision was taken to try and get past the checkpoint and continue their journey. Himmler and his 2 adjutants, Grothmann and Macher, would hold back while the rest of the group attempted to cross the bridge. At 3 p.m., Kiermaier and Himmler's personal doctor, Gebhardt, went to the bridge, apparently not realizing that there was an unguarded ford some distance down the river where everyone could have crossed without any problems. Kiermaier and Gebhardt intended to cross the bridge, and if there were no problems, come back and fetch the others. At 4 p.m., the 2 Germans were stopped on the bridge by Sergeant Ken Baysbrown of 1003 Field Security Reserve Detachment, the British Army's Intelligence Corps. He examined the men's demobilization passes and knew immediately that, as secret field police, they must be arrested. But keeping this to himself, Baysbrown quickly learned from Dr. Gebhardt that he was but the vanguard of a much larger group of sick ex-secret field police. Baysbrown quickly organized 2 army trucks and an escort to bring in the rest of Gebhardt's comrades. Baysbrown, using Loser's Mill on the river as an office, informed his commander, Staff Sergeant John Hogg, that a party of secret field police was shortly to arrive. The trucks duly returned with Gebhardt and the rest of the group, but minus 3 men, these being Himmler and his adjutants. Another NCO, Sergeant Arthur Britton, who was actually Dutch-born, examined the Germans' documents. They all bore secret field police stamps dated the 1st or 3rd of May 1945, with smudged SD stamps. Some of the Germans now denied being members of the group. The youngest German was taken into the mill and interrogated by Britton and Baysbrown. He quickly confessed that the secret field police stamp was from SD headquarters, and they all belonged in one group. At 6 p.m., everyone was arrested, and trucks drove them to the civilian internment camp at Westertimke near Zeven. However, Sergeant Hogg retained Dr. Gebhardt, and together they drove to the farm to collect the 3 remaining men. But on arrival, Himmler and his cohorts had made themselves scarce. British intelligence was alerted to 3 secret field police suspects on the run in the area. Himmler's little group assumed that Kiermaier and Gebhardt's group had successfully crossed the bridge checkpoint. They waited and then tried themselves on the 22nd of May. The trio walked through the streets of Bremerwerder. Grothmann and Macher wore long SS officers' raincoats minus insignia and walked either side of the much shorter Himmler, who wore bits of German army uniform, a blue raincoat and an eye patch. Before they reached the bridge, a British patrol stopped them and escorted them to the mill for questioning. Sergeant Britton received them and reported their arrival by phone to Staff Sergeant Hogg. Heinrich Himmler was now in Allied hands, but for the time being his real identity was not known to them. He was just another low-ranking German soldier to be processed into a holding camp because of his unit's World War II role. Himmler spent his first night in British captivity with Grothmann and Macher, sleeping on the floor of the mill, using grain sacks as mattresses. The important point was that if Himmler's false identity continued to hold up, he could expect to be released after a few weeks or months, perhaps earlier, enabling him to continue with his plan, as he had told Dönitz's foreign minister Count Schwerin von Krosigk in early May 1945, during which he said that the Allies would never find him, that he would lie low and await political developments. When questioned, Himmler and his companions all claimed to be sergeants in the secret field police, but the smudged SD stamps on their papers were suspicious. When the British examined Himmler's baggage, they confiscated a large magnifying glass embossed with Nazi eagle wings, but apparently thought little of it. The rest of Himmler's personal items, some of them inscribed with his monogram HH, or even his title RFSS, had been hidden at the farm and would be found much later by Intelligence Corps NCOs. At 7 a.m. on the 23rd of May, Himmler and his companions were driven to Westertimke Camp via Zeven, headquarters, the 45th Field Security Station of the British Army, arriving around 9 a.m. After processing, Himmler and his adjutants were next driven 45 miles southeast to Kolkhagen, a special interrogation camp near the village of Barnstedt, arriving after several stops around 6:30 p.m. Himmler was immediately recognized by some of the prisoners standing by the wire watching new arrivals, despite his shaved-off moustache and black eye patch. Particularly by prisoner Karl Kaufmann, the former Gauleiter of Hamburg, who had met Himmler on multiple occasions. Kaufmann said that Himmler didn't recognize him, or at least pretended not to do so, and shortly afterwards removed his eye patch. Before long, most of the prisoners knew that Himmler was in residence. It appears that Himmler now knew that the game was up. Sooner or later, the British would be informed by a prisoner regarding his identity. But Himmler still had some aces up his sleeve. He was, after all, the most senior Nazi in Allied captivity, and privy to a vast amount of secret information that he might use in his favour, including information embarrassing to the British. Perhaps, thought Himmler, he might yet be able to make a deal of some kind. In any case, he could expect months or even years of questioning by Allied intelligence and war crimes investigators before he would ever be brought to trial, and what he knew of hidden treasures, secret bank accounts, even more secret deals, and of Soviet intelligence operations, plus the vast SS spy networks which still existed, were surely of immense value to his captors, who were at that moment combing Germany for men useful to them in the new Cold War that was in its opening stages. With self-preservation in mind, Himmler now demanded to see the camp commandant, Captain Thomas Sylvester, and after some argument with British NCOs, he was duly granted an interview at 7 p.m. Himmler led the trio into Sylvester's office. The British officer described Himmler as small, ill-looking and shabbily dressed. His companions looked different, evidently military men, by their tall, erect bearing and severe haircuts. Sylvester ordered Grothmann and Macker removed from his office and kept under close guard. Himmler now put on a pair of glasses. Sylvester asked him his name, to which the prisoner replied quietly, Herr Heinrich Himmler. Sylvester immediately phoned British Second Army headquarters at Lüneburg, speaking to Major Rice, an intelligence officer who initially didn't believe him. However, after a slightly muddled conversation, Major Rice announced that he was starting out for Kolkhagen immediately. While Sylvester waited for help, he ordered Himmler to strip, and NCOs carefully examined his clothing. A brass capsule container was found containing a glass ampule, evidently a cyanide capsule. Sylvester asked Himmler what it was. He replied, "That is my medicine. It cures stomach cramp." A second brass container was found. This one was empty. Sylvester ordered a full body search, but did not search Himmler's mouth, fearful that Himmler had the glass ampule of cyanide in his mouth ready to kill himself with. Here things become a bit bizarre. Himmler dressed, and Sylvester ordered tea and thick British Army sandwiches, and Himmler tucked into both. If, as was later claimed, Himmler had concealed a glass ampule of cyanide in his mouth, measuring 35 by 9 millimeters, how could he have eaten thick sandwiches and drunken tea? Clearly nothing was in his mouth at the time, and the missing ampule was not on his person or in his clothing, which had been thoroughly searched. Either that, or the afternoon tea scenario was invented by Sylvester for some reason. It appears, though Sylvester later denied it, that Himmler was allowed to shave and freshen up due to the growth of stubble reported on his corpse a short time later, expressly against regulations concerning war crime suspects. Major Rice and his team of intelligence officers arrived at Kolkhagen about 7:30 p.m. Rice carried with him a photograph of Himmler in his black Allgemeine SS uniform, plus a short biography that included both his date of birth, his Nazi and SS membership numbers, and a copy of his signature. However, Rice didn't have any details of Himmler's weight, height, or any other personal information like this, or a set of fingerprints. Rice's task was simple: establish Himmler's identity beyond a reasonable doubt. Himmler gave a vague answer when asked for his NSDAP membership number, and an equally imprecise though reasonably accurate SS number. He gave his correct date of birth. Asked to provide a signature, Himmler agreed on the strange condition that it be destroyed immediately afterwards. The signature matched the specimen Rice had brought with him, and Himmler was formally identified as the Reichsführer SS. Himmler was very chatty and mentioned a letter he had written to Field Marshal Sir Bernard Montgomery on the 8th of May, and even told Rice that his intention had been to lie low for a few weeks until things in Germany had calmed down, and as he said, circumstances were more favourable for an interview. He told Rice that the Soviet Union was the greater enemy, predicting war between the Allies very soon. Overall, Himmler tried to cultivate a cooperative demeanour with his captors, the exact opposite, in fact, of a man preparing to commit suicide. Rice telephoned Lüneburg and spoke with his boss, Colonel Michael Murphy, Chief of Intelligence, British Second Army. Murphy now set out to take charge of Himmler, the prize prisoner. Murphy was at the time rather out of sorts, suffering the effects of a string of victory parties. He got a lift to Kolkhagen in the car of Colonel M.A.C. Osborne, GSO-1, General Staff Officer 1, Military Intelligence Operations, 2nd Army. They arrived at the camp at 9:45 p.m. Rice and Murphy conferred, then Murphy ordered Himmler to strip for a second time, which he refused to do. Murphy threatened him with being forcibly stripped, and Himmler reluctantly complied. Afterwards, Himmler refused to don British battle dress and wore only a grey German army shirt, his underpants and socks, his original uniform being retained by the British. An army blanket was handed to him in lieu of a coat. Murphy was, according to his later statements, concerned about the missing cyanide ampule. He decided to have a doctor conduct a body cavity search, not at the camp, but at a requisitioned house in Lüneburg, ominously called the House for Special Purposes, located at 31A Ulsenerstrasse. A doctor was to meet them at the house. This again is rather strange. Why didn't Murphy order the camp doctor to simply conduct the body cavity search? Allowing Himmler to go for a nice drive in a car, of course, would give him the opportunity once again to kill himself. At 10:40 p.m., Himmler got into a car, sitting in the back between Murphy's second-in-command and a guard, Murphy in the front passenger seat. Himmler even offered driving directions when Murphy became lost on the way to Lüneburg. It would prove to be Himmler's last journey, as we shall see in the next episode when we examine what exactly occurred at 31A Ulsenerstrasse that resulted in the Reichsführer's death. Arriving at 31A Ulsenerstrasse, Murphy and Himmler were met by Captain Clement Wells of the Royal Army Medical Corps, a 55-year-old officer and in civilian life a general practitioner. He was considerably older than Colonel Murphy, who of course outranked him. The other person to meet them was Company Sergeant Major Edwin Austin of the Headquarters Defence Company. Murphy ordered Wells to examine Himmler for poison, to which the annoyed Dr. Wells replied, "I am a doctor, not a detective." Murphy, a young, rather arrogant man, snapped back at him, "You will do as you are told." With this strain between the Allied officers involved, the examination now went ahead. Himmler was not the first senior Nazi to have passed through the hands of the staff at 31A Ulsenerstrasse. SS Obergruppenführer Hans Adolf Putzmann, higher SS and police leader for Russia, North and Ukraine, had been appointed by Himmler to set up the Wehrwolf stay-behind Nazi partisan forces in Germany. Captured on the 21st of May 1945, the 43-year-old Putzmann had committed suicide inside number 31A. He had apparently swallowed poison, despite being searched thoroughly several times. Colonel Murphy was, apparently, keen that such an event would never occur again on his watch, or so he later said. Bear in mind that by the time Himmler entered the front parlour of 31A Ulsenerstrasse, Lüneburg, on the 23rd of May 1945, 2 days after General Putzmann had died in the same room, he had been subjected to 2 thorough strip searches. His mouth had certainly not been searched, but he had been fed both hot tea and British Army doorstep sandwiches at Kolkhagen camp, somehow managing to chew and swallow despite the later contention that he was concealing a glass cyanide capsule in his mouth that measured 35 by 9 millimeters. This seems very unlikely. The Army's subsequent report on Himmler's death is riddled with inconsistencies due to witness testimonies that conflict to the official line. And frankly, it suggests a sanitized version of the truth was offered to either protect Colonel Murphy's reputation and that of his men for who bungled the search, or for some more nefarious reason. The front parlour, unlike the official report and illustrations from the period, was unfurnished and freezing cold, the windows standing wide open. Himmler, according to the report, stripped for the 3rd time. Murphy left the room, probably to use the lavatory, as he was still hungover. The only other person in the room, apart from Dr. Wells, was Company Sergeant Major Austin. In his search for poison, Wells decided to examine Himmler's mouth first and not to examine his rectum, the only other hiding place. Wells examined Himmler all over, lulling him into a false sense of security, then asked him to open his mouth. This Himmler did. Wells then claimed to see the tip of a small object sticking up between the left cheek and teeth. At this point, Himmler bit down hard on the object and Wells' fingers, crushing a glass ampule of cyanide. His face constricted with pain and went bright red, his veins standing out, eyes going glassy, and he collapsed to the floor. Wells shouted, "My God, it's in his mouth! He's done it on me!" The latter doesn't sound, according to one historian, to be the utterances of a well-educated middle-class country doctor. Several other people rushed into the room as Wells tried to mop out Himmler's mouth with a wet handkerchief, and also tried to give him artificial respiration. At one point, Himmler was jerked up by the ankles in an attempt to make the poison run out. Himmler breathed heavily for 30 seconds, and his pulse continued for another minute longer. Then he died. So ended Heinrich Himmler. The question is, why would Himmler have committed suicide at the point alleged by the official British report on the affair? This was the 3rd physical search he had been given that evening, and he had been treated well, given food and drink, offered fresh clothing, and not abused in any way. It should be remembered that Himmler had voluntarily revealed his identity to the Allies, which seemed strange if he was planning to commit suicide. He had had plenty of opportunities to kill himself before his arrival at 31A Ulsenerstrasse, when he was first arrested on the bridge, the night he spent in the mill sleeping on grain sacks, when he arrived at Kolkhagen camp, during his interview with Major Sylvester, in the car ride to Lüneburg with Colonel Murphy. It doesn't make sense. It has been suggested that the man who died in the parlour at Ulsenerstrasse was a double, but I find it hard to believe that all of Himmler's closest staff would have voluntarily accompanied a double into British captivity instead of escaping with their boss, especially as 2 of them, General Otto Ohlendorf and Dr. Gebhard, were wanted war criminals who would in due course be tried and hanged for their crimes. Various theories are currently abroad concerning what precisely happened to Himmler in that house in Lüneburg, given that he was the most high-profile Nazi prisoner that the British had captured, Hermann Göring having surrendered himself to the Americans. Theory 1 is that Himmler committed suicide, as the official report states, by use of a concealed cyanide capsule in his mouth during Dr. Wells' medical examination. Theory 2 is that the man who committed suicide was not Himmler, but a double, and I've stated the reasons why I think this theory doesn't hold water. Theory 3. Himmler was forcibly given a cyanide capsule during the course of the examination in order that the British could claim that he had committed suicide. Why? perhaps to protect certain important British politicians, perhaps also including Prime Minister Churchill from public humiliation if Himmler was allowed to publicly testify at the Nuremberg trials, as he was privy as head of various police and intelligence services to secret negotiations allegedly made between the British and German governments in 1940 to 41 to end the war, and also many other very embarrassing things involving British and even American intelligence services and the Nazis. What truth there is in any of this is very hard to sort out, due to certain archival sources still being classified or inaccessible to historians. Himmler certainly knew everyone's dirty secrets, as he had spent years accumulating information through his spy networks, and also his control over the Abwehr, German military intelligence, following the removal of spy master Admiral Wilhelm Canaris following the July plot. It cannot be discounted as a theory for several reasons, the primary one being the refusal of the British government to release all of its files on Himmler's capture and demise until 2045, 100 years after his death, indicating intelligence interest in the entire case and something that needed to be covered up. Theory number 4 is a newish one, but not beyond the realms of possibility either. Several researchers suggest that Company Sergeant Major Austin beat Himmler to death, and the suicide story was concocted to cover up this event. Austin would only have done such a thing if ordered to do so. I managed to obtain a full copy of Himmler's post-mortem examination report, and in it the pathologist notes some abrasions on his heels. Himmler's nose was slightly bent to the right, and some facial asymmetry was noted on the corpse that was not seen in the photos of a live Himmler, but no injuries consistent with being beaten to death. I am inclined to dismiss this last theory, as such a messy execution method would make it very difficult to make it look like suicide by cyanide. And just in case you are wondering, according to the report, Himmler was 5 feet 8.5 inches tall, had thin brown hair with a bald patch 3 by 2¼ inches on the crown, had most of his own teeth in excellent condition and grey eyes. He had a hairy chest, was slightly overweight, and had a weak chin. May 1945. The Reichsführer SS was dead at the age of 44, lying on the floor at the front parlour of 31A Ulsenerstrasse, Lüneburg, Germany. But that was by no means the end of the story regarding Heinrich Himmler. In many ways it was just the beginning. Some sort of investigation would have to follow to establish, officially at least, what had occurred that led to Himmler's death. At the time of his demise, Himmler was in the custody of Colonel Michael Murphy, Chief of Intelligence, British Second Army. But witnesses corroborate that Murphy most likely had left the room before Himmler's death to run to the lavatory, as he was hungover with an upset stomach. The only persons in the room before Himmler died, officially at least, were medical doctor Clement Wells and Company Sergeant Major Edwin Austin of the Headquarters Defence Company. However, during the commotion that followed Himmler's allegedly biting down on a cyanide capsule when Dr. Wells examined his mouth, other intelligence officers of the House rushed into the room, notably Major Norman Whittaker, helping with efforts to flush the poison out of Himmler. One of Whittaker's friends was visiting him when the drama occurred. Captain Norman Rimmer, shortly after Himmler's death, went to the Padres mess and on his own initiative asked the army priests, who were involved in a game of whiskey bridge at the time, if Himmler would be given a decent Christian burial. Among the officers playing cards was Brigadier Hugh Glynn Hughes, senior medical officer for the British Second Army. The impatient and testy Glynn Hughes telephoned Colonel Murphy and asked him to send a doctor who could satisfy Himmler's cause of death. He also told Murphy that, in due course, a post-mortem examination would be conducted, the report to act as an identification document. In the meantime, Himmler's corpse remained on the parlour floor, naked, covered by a single army blanket, and would remain under guard all night. The next morning, 24th of May, a group of army padres arrived at 9:30 to view the body, followed by a group of British female soldiers of the Auxiliary Territorial Service. The guards entertained them by lifting the blanket and showing them Himmler's genitals, to much ribald commentary and laughter. But higher up the chain of command, nobody was laughing. The other Allied nations would be extremely dismayed when they found out that the prize prisoner Himmler had died in British captivity. Some damage control was necessary, and with this in mind, the still hungover Colonel Murphy called a conference at 1:30 p.m. to decide on the party line. Dr. Wells was summoned to appear before the committee, and Murphy warned him in no uncertain terms not to discuss what had occurred in the front parlour with anyone. Also present with Murphy was his second-in-command, Lieutenant Colonel Joe Hewitt, and another intelligence officer, Lieutenant Colonel Stapleton, and two officers whose identities have never been revealed, but I should hazard a guess were from MI6. The Murphy Committee decided to curtail exposure and get Himmler's body buried as quickly as possible. However, at 1:40 p.m., Murphy excused himself from the meeting, apparently too unwell to continue. Left in charge of the body was Intelligence Officer Major Norman Whittaker and Company Sergeant Major Austin. It was decided to photograph the corpse in situ, and 3 men were involved in this. Sergeant Carl Sutton of the Army Photography Unit, and Sergeant McCandle and Ken Gordon of Pathé News, who were shoot some film of the scene, the room now having been refurnished to make it appear more homely instead of an interrogation centre. Just as filming finished at 2 p.m., a U.S. liaison officer arrived to view the corpse. He was followed at 4 p.m. by 3 Soviet liaison officers. Captain Kuchin demanded to speak to Colonel Murphy, who remained conveniently unavailable due to his surprisingly long-lasting hangover, frustrating Soviet attempts to find out what had happened to Himmler in British custody. Instead, Major Whittaker showed the Soviets the corpse. The Soviets did not agree that the body was Himmler's. Instead, on arriving back at Flensburg, Captain Kuchin cabled Berlin, asking that senior Soviet intelligence officer Colonel Vasily Gorbushin come to Lüneburg at once. The circus continued into the evening, with famous Australian war correspondent Chester Wilmot and 3 other reporters viewing the corpse. Wilmot's broadcast of Himmler's death was aired by BBC Radio at 8 p.m., before any medical examination had been made or the corpse properly identified. Himmler spent another night lying on the front parlour floor, during which time 2 soldiers broke into the room, propped up his corpse and photographed him again. At 9:30 on the morning of the 25th of May, Brigadier Glyn Hughes phoned Colonel Brown of the Royal Army Dental Corps and asked him to come over and take medical and dental records to aid identification of the corpse. Brown quickly collected his equipment and some rubber and plaster of Paris and drove to Ulsenerstrasse with his assistant, Major George Atkins. Waiting for them at the house was Army pathologist Captain M.C. Bond, the 74th British General Hospital, Lüneburg. Dr. Bond commenced his post-mortem examination of Himmler at 11 a.m. Present also were Major Atkins and Colonel Brown, mortuary attendant Private White, and laboratory assistant Sergeant Glynn. The examination was not made under ideal conditions, being performed on the floor under the natural light coming in through the bay windows. The report, as I noted in the previous episode, was nonetheless exceptionally thorough. The army dentists examined Himmler's teeth, though their report, seen here, does not note any fragments of glass in the mouth that would have been present if Himmler had bitten down on a glass ampule of cyanide. This is a strange omission, and perhaps is evidence that the cyanide story wasn't yet quite right, or at least worked out by the intelligence officers. Brown and Atkins then made 2 latex death masks of Himmler. One would be sent to General Eisenhower's headquarters, and the other one was retained by Brown, Colonel Murphy probably not realizing that Brown had done this. This mask was later donated to the Army Medical Services Museum by Brown, providing some interesting evidence concerning the state of Himmler's face at the time of his death, in comparison to film and photographs of him alive. Many have suggested that the mask face shows signs of damage inconsistent with the official report of cyanide poisoning. Finally, we have evidence of a procedure being conducted on the corpse. One of the guards outside the door, Corporal Bill Carrot, was called in to assist. At this point, Dr. Bond removed Himmler's brain. This fact was reported widely in 1945. I've discovered references to this removal in several contemporary newspapers and magazines. The 26th of May 1945 edition of the Daily News of Perth, Australia, picked this story off the wire in an article titled Himmler Buried. Quote, "Before the burial, doctors and detectives took fingerprints, examined the nails and teeth, and measured each limb. They also took the death mask and a cast of his ears. The brain and part of his skeleton were removed." The following day's edition of the 2nd Army Troops News Journal, an army newspaper for soldiers serving in Germany, ran a story titled Unmarked Grave for Himmler, in which it was stated, quote, "British Army surgeons took casts of his features and removed the brain and parts of the skull." End quote. Time magazine also asserted that the brain was removed, noting in an article on the 4th of June 1945, quote, "Medical authorities removed the brain, took plaster casts of the skull." End quote. Thereafter, the story of the removal of Himmler's brain went incredibly quiet for 40 years, until the Mirror, a famous British newspaper, ran a series of articles on the 6th of May 1985, close to the anniversary of the end of World War II in Europe. In a side article entitled Riddle of the Lost Brain, they reported, quote, "Bill Carrot helped the pathologist who carried out the post-mortem examination. He said, 'I was told to hold Himmler's head. The doctor cut the top with a knife, and I looked away. Afterwards, the doctor put Himmler's brain in a container which held a solution." End quote. The Mirror reported that, quote, "The brain was sent to London for examination by scientists so they could discover the source of his evil, but since then its location has remained a mystery." End quote. The removal of the brains of World War II leaders for study was not limited to Himmler's. Following Italian dictator Benito Mussolini's execution, probably by Italian partisans, and the public display and abuse of his corpse in Milan, the US Army had it removed to a local mortuary for a post-mortem examination. Mussolini's brain was removed and sent to the US for study, doctors hoping to find the root cause of the Duce's behavior, as they suspected he suffered from syphilis. In the event, they didn't discover syphilis, but the brain subsequently disappeared. Only in 1966 was most of the brain returned to Mussolini's widow, but some slices were retained by the US government. Incredibly, parts of Mussolini's brain and some blood samples ended up for sale on eBay in the 2000s, priced at €15,000. They were quietly removed from sale following an outcry from Mussolini's granddaughter. Another Axis leader whose brain was removed post-mortem was German Labour Front leader Robert Ley. Ley, on trial at Nuremberg, managed to hang himself in his cell on the 25th of October 1945. It was supposed that Ley was mentally ill, and the brain was removed and sectioned. This only came to light in 2007, when glass photographic transparencies of Ley's brain were found among the effects of Nuremberg trials psychiatrist Dr. Douglas Kelly, who himself had committed suicide a decade or so after the war. Returning to the problem of Himmler's corpse, Colonel Murphy decided to get rid of it, and quickly. In the early hours of the 26th of May 1945, after Himmler's third night on the front parlour floor, a British Army truck from the Headquarters Defence Company backed up to the rear of 31A Ulsenerstrasse. Himmler's body had been prepared for burial by Major Whittaker and Company Sergeant Major Austin and his men. It had been wrapped in a length of camouflage material bound with wire. Loaded aboard the truck, which was driven by Sergeant Weston, the body was escorted in the back by Sergeant Ken Ottery. The truck was followed by Major Whittaker driving a jeep, with Austin in the passenger seat. After driving around for hours, Whittaker settled on a burial site on Lüneburg Heath. Weston and Ottery dug a grave. Himmler's body was unceremoniously thrown in and then covered over, the site disguised with branches and leaves, and Whittaker noted its coordinates on a map. The party then drove back to Lüneburg, and Whittaker reported to Murphy. Though the Allies were upset by not being able to identify the body themselves, any questions regarding the manner of Himmler's death were now conveniently and neatly curtailed by the hasty burial of the biggest piece of evidence, his corpse. Later, on the 26th of May, Murphy once again decided not to meet with a delegation of Soviet officers led by Colonel Gorbushin. The Soviets demanded, however, that Himmler be exhumed, a request that was ignored. It is interesting to know that Gorbushin carried with him a set of Himmler's actual dental records captured in Berlin, which could have been used to positively identify the body. Even more incredibly, Gorbushin was denied a copy of Colonel Brown's dental chart, seen here, hand-drawn by him and Major Atkins during the post-mortem. We have to ask the question, why? Colonel Brown also asserted that Himmler's fingerprints were not taken, at variance with the established story. Next to arrive were two Americans at 3 p.m. They told Murphy that they were holding Himmler's brother Gebhard and his mistress Hedwig Potthast, who could be brought to identify the body. Less than impressed to learn that the body had already been buried, Colonel Murphy was forced to talk to them. A blazing row followed, though the British managed to resist exhuming the corpse, at least for now. Everything went quiet until early 1946. By that time, most of the players from the events of the 23rd of May 1945 at Ulsenerstrasse had moved on to jobs in civilian life. But quite out of the blue, several were suddenly contacted by the War Office in London and told to be prepared to appear before a board of inquiry to be held in Germany, including Dr. Wells, who had been examining Himmler's mouth when he allegedly bit down on the cyanide capsule, and Major Whittaker, who had buried the body on Lüneburg Heath. It appears that some doubt had crept into the identification of Heinrich Himmler in May 1945, doubts that led to the decision to exhume Himmler's corpse and conduct a second examination. The man chosen to conduct this examination was the highly experienced Dr. Ian Morris of Unit No. 2 War Crimes Commission, then collating evidence of Nazi atrocities in the British occupation zone of Germany. Himmler's corpse was exhumed a second time after being relocated by Major Whittaker and taken by truck to the morgue at the British Military Hospital in Hanover. Apart from Dr. Morris, two unidentified British civilians were present, along with Corporal D.W. Williams of the Royal Army Medical Corps. Morris reported that the corpse was in reasonable condition, its skin slimy and swollen. Incredibly, Morris was not given Dr. Bond's original post-mortem report, nor Colonel Brown's dental report. He instead had some German X-rays of Himmler's teeth. But incredibly, most of Himmler's teeth were missing. As Colonel Brown's diagram shows, Himmler had all of his teeth when examined on the 25th of May 1945, but at some time between then and his burial, most of them had been pulled out. Was this deliberate destruction of dental evidence to prevent identification of the body, particularly as the Soviets turned up with Himmler's actual dental chart for comparison? Dr. Morris could not really come to any conclusions regarding the identity of the body due to its state of preservation and missing teeth, meaning that the identification of the man who died in the front parlour at 31A Ulsenerstrasse remains contentious today. So what about the missing brain? I've spent the best part of a year trying to locate it, and I believe it still exists. Frustratingly, Dr. Bond did not leave any records concerning where the brain was sent. By deductive reasoning, we can assume that such a significant object was sent to one of the world's leading neuropathologists in London for study. The files on Himmler held at the Museum of Military Medicine only cover the post-mortem examination and the dental chart created by Colonel Brown, as well as the aforementioned press cuttings concerning the removal of Himmler's brain. However, a little research reveals that the preeminent brain study centre in Britain in 1945 was the Institute of Neurology in London, now subsumed into University College London. From this lead, research shows that the leading neuropathologist in the post-war period was Professor John Corsellis, who maintained a brain bank, a collection of specimen brains at Runwell Hospital. A UCL archivist highlighted that after Corsellis' death, the brain bank was kept going until the Runwell Hospital was closed in the 1990s. The famous brain bank and all of its specimens was sold to SINAPS, the Scientific Initiative for Neuropsychiatric and Psychopharmacological Studies in Belgium. This collection is currently housed at the Duffel Psychiatric Hospital in Belgium. I recently received a reply from my inquiry saying that a thorough search of their records reveals nothing regarding Himmler. Another name given to me in connection with the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery in London was Professor Joseph Godwin Greenfield, sometimes described as the father of neuropathology and in post at the time of Himmler's death. Had the brain been sent to him? A thorough search of his personal papers held at University College London Library did not turn up any references to Himmler whatsoever. Another avenue that might shed light on where the brain was sent was an examination of the private papers of Brigadier Hugh Glynn Hughes, the commander of the medical services for the British Second Army in May 1945, and the man who actually ordered Dr. Bond to conduct the post-mortem examination of Himmler. His papers reside at the Wellcome Institute in London. I made a thorough search of his extensive papers and found nothing concerning Himmler's brain. Strangely, I also found no mention of Himmler whatsoever, which, considering the high-profile nature of the prisoner and the controversy surrounding his death, appears odd. Glynn Hughes' papers certainly contain plenty of references to events before and after Himmler's death, but make no mention of anything concerning Himmler himself. We can surmise from this that Glynn Hughes was being careful not to highlight his involvement, or he had been told to remain silent on the subject. So, another dead end regarding the quest for the missing brain. Casting my net more widely, I contacted the handful of brain banks that still exist in the UK in the hopes of a lead. More rejections, though some were friendly, others almost legal in their replies. For example, the Cambridge Brain Bank gave me the following very non-committal reply. Quote, "In compliance with the Human Tissue Act, post-mortem material held in our brain bank is anonymized for researcher inquiries and requests." End quote. In other words, if we have it, we won't tell you. If we don't have it, we won't tell you. The conclusion I must draw from my research is that Himmler's brain may still exist, but the likelihood of any institution admitting that they actually have it is remote, undoubtedly due to the negative publicity such an admission would generate, particularly in the press. It would also open a terrible can of worms concerning what to do with such an object. However, I'd like to ask anyone with information to come forward and contact me at hello@markfelton.co.uk, as I'm sure somebody knows something. Several people have already contacted me regarding the previous videos about Himmler's capture and death, providing fascinating information that is credible yet at odds with the official British story, indicating that the whiff of conspiracy still lingers over the death of the Reichsfuhrer SS. As for what became of Himmler's body, following the second post-mortem examination in 1946, the head was X-rayed by the authorities, apparently for purposes of identification, but these X-rays have never been made public. Himmler's corpse, far from what is reported in most history books, was not reinterred in his grave on Lüneburg Heath, but instead Corporal D.W. Williams, a mortuary assistant at Hanover Military Hospital, was ordered to take it to the hospital crematoria where it was incinerated. So if Himmler's brain can be found, DNA testing will at least settle one important question that has lingered over his death. Was the man who died in the front parlour of 31A Ulsenerstrasse Heinrich Himmler or a double? The willful destruction of forensic evidence, while the corpse was in British hands, including the pulling out of the teeth prior to the first burial and the withholding of important identifying evidence from the pathologists, primarily Himmler's actual dental X-rays and several other points I've raised, have certainly contributed to the conspiracy that Himmler actually escaped justice in 1945. My personal view, based on everything I know about the case so far, is that the man who died in Lüneburg in May 1945 was Heinrich Himmler. But I'm not satisfied with the official story of his death, and I feel that the British authorities hid or suppressed the truth of what occurred in that room. Either Himmler died due to incompetence on the part of his captors, or due to malice, and realistically we will probably never know the truth. For when the records concerning Himmler's death are finally released in 23 years' time, perhaps, finally, the truth will out. The town of Berchtesgaden, which lies at the foot of the Obersalzberg mountain and contained Hitler's private home and other famous buildings like the Eagle's Nest, was captured on the afternoon of the 4th of May 1945 by troops of the 7th Infantry Regiment, US 3rd Infantry Division, even though the area was not officially assigned to them. Everyone and his brother wanted to climb the steep road up to Hitler's private village of the Obersalzberg and capture the badly damaged building complex, bombed by the British on the 27th of April and abandoned by the SS garrison as US forces entered Berchtesgaden down below. I've already made a video about the race for the Eagle's Nest, which is outside the remit of this program. Link in the end screen. Berchtesgaden was very important, for it was the Nazi administrative capital for this picturesque region of Bavaria bordering Austria, and contained many important Nazi buildings, including the mini Reich-Chancellery complex, a collection of wooden buildings containing ministries evacuated from bomb Berlin that continued to control government functions and military command throughout southern Germany. Shortly after capturing Berchtesgaden without a shot and clearing the town of German troops, a reconnaissance patrol moved down the road towards Schönau, a small town on the north shore of the Königssee, a stunning alpine lake surrounded by craggy snow-capped mountains. As they moved into the town, the GIs again checked the buildings, among them a large alpine chalet being used as Luftwaffe headquarters for the region. At Berchtesgaden station, the Americans had captured several trains loaded with art treasures. These were trains evacuated south by Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring a week earlier from his Karenhall estate outside Berlin. Locals had looted many of the wagons, looking for food, drink, and other useful items. Unbeknown to the US troops edging into Schönau, more Göring loot, much of it gold, was hidden in a secret bunker in a cave near the town. This would eventually be found and recovered on the 25th of May 1945. One of the houses the US troops entered and cleared was a large alpine chalet with outbuildings, located at the end of a quiet road about 1 kilometer from Königssee, named the Schneewinkellehren. The owner had left in a hurry, leaving behind most of their belongings. A rudimentary search revealed that this was the house of Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer SS, and after Hitler, the most wanted man in Germany. If you've watched the previous episodes in this series, you will know that on the 4th of May 1945, Himmler was nowhere near Bavaria. He was in fact in northern Germany, having established his final headquarters, and still hoping to play some useful role in Germany's final days in World War II. Opening wardrobes and cupboards, the GIs found Himmler's uniforms, photographs and other personal items, including a set of his medals. Naturally, a lot of this material would be pocketed by souvenir-hungry Americans over the coming days. The house was evidently a family home. It had a woman's touch, and women's clothing hung in closets. There were also 2 children's rooms for a boy and a girl. What the GIs had in fact captured was Himmler's love nest, the house he had purchased in 1943 for his mistress, one of his personal assistants named Hedwig Potthast. Potthast, who was a young secretary, had caught the Reichsführer's attention in the late 1930s. Himmler was unhappily married to his wife Margarete, but doted on his daughter Gudrun, and she discovered Himmler's relationship with Potthast in 1941. Himmler and his wife had separated, though never divorced. Himmler already owned a house at Gmünd on the Tegernsee south of Munich that he had purchased in 1933 and had remodeled and enlarged in 1936. Himmler, though extremely powerful, never had a house on top of the Obersalzberg. Bormann did, and Göring did, and also Albert Speer further down the mountain. But Bormann, who was really an enemy of Himmler, managed to keep him at bay and away from the centre of power. When Himmler visited the Berghof, he, along with many other senior officials and generals, stayed at either the large Platterhof Hotel or a special VIP guest house at the Obersalzberg, or in one of several luxurious hotels down the mountain in Berchtesgaden. This was a rather unsatisfactory arrangement. With Himmler's separation from his wife in 1941, he no longer spent some months living at the house at Gmünd every year. The property, however, remained in Himmler's ownership, but only his wife and daughter lived in it, along with household staff and SS guards accommodated in a special barracks building. There was also a bunker in the garden in case of air attack, constructed on Himmler's orders to protect his family, and built by 20 special prisoners sent from Dachau concentration camp, one of whom died during the construction. In the meantime, Hedwig Potthast had given birth to an illegitimate child with Himmler, a son they named Helga, in February 1942. Potthast's parents disapproved of their daughter's relationship with Himmler, but Himmler determined to provide a proper home for his mistress and his new son. Incredibly, Himmler, though master of a huge industrial empire based upon slave labor, didn't have much personal wealth, and it was noted that he was one of the few senior Nazis not to have had his hand in the till. He instead went cap in hand to Bormann for a loan from Nazi Party funds, and Bormann advanced Himmler 80,000 Reichsmarks in 1943. Himmler used the money to purchase Schneewinkelleen, a pretty alpine chalet sat on a large plot of land about a kilometre from Königssee. Ironically, this house had once been the holiday home of none other than the famous Jewish psychoanalyst Dr. Sigmund Freud. The funds were used to modernize the property and provide guard facilities and an air raid bunker, what Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, disparagingly labeled Himmler's bomb-proof love nest. Himmler would live at Schneewinkelleen whenever he visited Berchtesgaden and the Obersalzberg. On the 20th of July 1944, when Colonel Count von Stauffenberg attempted to kill Hitler with a bomb at his Eastern Front headquarters, the Wolf's Lair, Hedwig Potthast gave birth to Himmler's second illegitimate child and second daughter, Nanette Dorothea, in Berchtesgaden Hospital. As the war situation continued to deteriorate, Himmler's command responsibilities kept him away from the Berchtesgaden area more and more, and eventually Hitler also moved away from the Berghof, never to return. With the rapid approach of US forces into the region, all the senior Nazis and their families living around Berchtesgaden were under threat. Himmler saw Potthast in person for the final time in mid-March 1945, when she visited him at his special sanatorium apartment at Hohenlichen in northern Germany. But he kept in contact with her and also with his daughter Gudrun at Gmund via telephone, phoning daily until the 19th of April 1945. The following day, Himmler went to the bomb-scarred Reichschancellery in Berlin to wish Hitler happy birthday for the final time, leaving later that day to go north to continue his secret efforts to make a separate peace with the Western Allies, efforts that would eventually lead to his being unmasked and his downfall. The same day, Gmund fell to US forces. Margarete Himmler and her daughter Gudrun were nowhere to be seen when US forces entered their house in Gmund, having moved into German-occupied northern Italy some time earlier. The Himmler residence was thoroughly combed for intelligence and then stripped by souvenir hunters. The last word Potthast received from Himmler was a letter hand-delivered by an SS officer to a house on the 19th of April 1945. In it, Himmler mentioned the difficulties he was facing and the hope that God would protect her, the children, and Germany. By early May, US forces were also approaching Berchtesgaden, and Potthast took her 2 children and moved to Aachensee in Austria. The house at Schönau was captured on the 4th of May. As well as capturing Himmler's love nest, they also captured his car. This Grosse Mercedes W150 770K limousine, built in 1943 and belonging to the Reichschancellery motor pool in Berlin. This was Himmler's official car when he was visiting the area, and it was kept at his house and used to collect him from the airfield at Einring or shuttling him between his house at Schönau and the Obersalzberg. It is now on display at the Auto and Technik Museum, Sinsheim, Germany, a fascinating survivor from the end of the war at Berchtesgaden. Himmler's wife, Margarete, and her daughter Gudrun were arrested by US forces in Bolzano, Italy, at the end of the war. Held in a succession of camps in Italy, France, and Germany, Margarete was carefully questioned, but she evidently knew little of her estranged husband's political life. Mother and daughter were released following the Nuremberg trials in November 1946. Denazified in 1948 as a lesser offender Category 3, after a legal challenge she was reclassified as a sympathizer, or Category 4. However, a fresh set of proceedings against her by the state of Bavaria led to her being reclassified Category 2, activist, militants and profiteers, and she was sentenced to 30 days punitive work, lost her pension rights and the right to vote. She spent her final years living in a modest apartment in Munich with her daughter and died in August 1967, aged 73. Her daughter Gudrun was deeply affected by her family's experiences and remained a vocal and strong defender of her father's memory, and also believed that he had not committed suicide but had been murdered by the British. She died in May 2018 at the age of 88. Hedwig Potthast learned of Himmler's death in British custody at Lüneburg on the 23rd of May 1945 via a radio announcement. Potthast went into hiding, living with Eleonora Pohl, wife of SS General Oswald Pohl, at Rosenheim in Bavaria. Pohl had been head of the SS Main Economic and Administrative Office and chief administrator of the concentration camp system. He would, in due course, be apprehended in May 1946 by British troops near Bremen, disguised as a farm worker, and was hanged in 1951 following a trial. The US Army eventually identified and arrested Potthast in July 1945. Interestingly, the officer who interrogated her was one we have already met if you've seen my video about Hermann Göring's missing medals, Major Paul Kubala. Kubala, a senior interrogator for the US 7th Army, and who it appears liberated Göring's famous Grand Cross of the Iron Cross and World War I pour le mérite following the Reichsmarshal's surrender to US forces, questioned Potthast, but it was clear that she didn't know of Himmler's plans, nor much of great interest to US intelligence. She was allowed to go free, and she lived in Teisendorf, staying in close contact with the family of Himmler's older brother, Gebhard, and also SS General Karl Wolff, the chief of Himmler's personal staff. Her son Helga, who suffered from ill health all his life, lived with her, and she married, changing her surname. Her daughter, Nanette Dorothea, became a medical doctor and is now retired. Hedwig Potthast died in Baden-Baden in September 1994 at the age of 82. Regarding what became of the homes of Himmler's wife and mistress, they both still exist today. Margarethe's home at Gmund is today a company headquarters, while Hedwig Potthast's home at Schönau on Königssee has been divided into self-catering holiday lets for the important tourist trade in the area. One aspect of the story of Heinrich Himmler's demise has bothered me for years. It's probably already occurred to many of you who have watched my series thus far or read about the subject more widely, and that is, why did Himmler go south? No answer is ever given in the history books. One explanation I've come across is that Himmler and his group planned to wander around for a few weeks until things had calmed down in the war's immediate aftermath, and then the Reichsfuhrer would re-emerge in some form onto the political stage. One aspect which many commentators have failed to recognize at this point is the fact of Himmler's intelligence and cunning. Do you think an idiot could have become as powerful as Himmler became? The man was careful, reserved, calculating, and extremely ruthless. He would have had a plan before he left his last headquarters in northern Germany to strike south, and I think I've found it. So the situation in early May 1945 for Heinrich Himmler was simple enough. He could have escaped with relative ease to neutral Sweden from the rump Nazi territory still under German control for about 3 weeks after the surrender, yet chose instead to drive south, the length of Allied-occupied Germany through the American and British zones, as many historians have alleged, to reach Bavaria, then under US occupation. The reasons for such a risky journey are never stated, only surmised. However, there was something in Germany that would have been of great interest to Himmler and his cohorts. Gold. Himmler's plan was apparently outlined by none other than one of his closest aides, who followed him into British captivity, SS Obersturmbannführer or Lieutenant Colonel Werner Grothmann. Grothmann told his interrogators that the plan was for Himmler's party to make it to the Harz Mountains, where it was felt Himmler could hide out until the hue and cry of the early occupation had abated, and instead of re-emerging into some sort of political sphere, make his way down to the Alps. Grothmann never explained what would happen once they crossed the Alps, but I think it's fairly self-explanatory where this story is going. One of the most important things that Himmler and his party needed, if such a move was to be successful, was money, mobile cash or bullion and valuables. So what did Himmler have in May 1945 that he could have taken with him? Himmler was clearly making plans for some kind of move even in April 1945, as he had 2 strongboxes stored at the house of SS Sturmbannführer or Major Heinrich Springer, Principal Staff Officer at Army Group Vistula, Himmler's last military command on the Eastern Front. According to Springer's wife, one box contained gold, jewelry and personal articles, including a valuable pearl necklace and some diamond-encrusted watches. The other box contained a large amount of banknotes in various foreign currencies. The strong boxes were collected from Frau Springer by a member of Himmler's personal staff, unknown to her, on the night of the 12th to 13th of May 1945 and never seen again. By this date, Himmler was already on the road and had left the area. Did the officer who collected the 2 strongboxes have orders to take them to the Harz Mountains, to this alleged hideout that Grothmann was talking about? It's a possibility. Or perhaps the officer simply helped himself, knowing that Himmler had already left the area. Himmler and his party did not appear to be travelling with boxes of bullion or cash in the cars. The only mention of money comes when Himmler's party abandoned their cars and bribed a fisherman with 500 Reichsmarks to ferry them across a river. The British never reported finding Himmler and his 14 travelling companions with pockets stuffed with gold, diamonds or cash, and Himmler's adjutants never said they were robbed of valuables by the British in interviews they gave after the war. Therefore it seems likely that Himmler would rendezvous with his mobile wealth later in his planned journey south. However, the idea of a move into hiding in the Harz Mountains for a few weeks or months was completely sensible, and it does in fact tie in with something else we know about Himmler, the location of an extremely large cache of gold. The Harz Mountains are located in Saxony and Thuringia, an area of 859 square miles of rugged, wooded highlands, the highest point standing just over 3,000 feet high. My research has led me to find a further compelling reason why Himmler, according to his senior adjutant, had decided on the Harz Mountains of all places to hide. Close by in Saxony is the city of Plauen. In 2015, a document was discovered by a researcher in the US National Archives. It was from Himmler ordering gold and also currency weighing about 900 kilograms to be deposited in the vault of a city post office in Plauen, a clandestine vault in effect. The city of Plauen, which was bombed heavily, fell to the advancing US forces on the 16th of April 1945, a fact that Himmler would have been fully aware of, and had been briefed on while he was still Reichsführer SS. Himmler would also have known that Plauen was destined to form part of the post-war Soviet occupation zone of Germany, since a map showing the post-war division of Germany had been captured by the Germans during the Ardennes offensive during the previous winter, which had caused quite a stir in the German High Command. The Americans didn't actually discover this stash until the 26th of April 1945, 11 days after occupying the city, and for all Himmler knew, they hadn't found it when he began his move towards the Harz Mountains in the second week of May 1945. All information about Plauen no longer flowing to the German camp because all communications had been cut off by the American occupation. This secret bank account was opened on Heinrich Himmler's personal orders and in his name in April 1944, again showing that Himmler was preparing for some sort of escape from Germany. It could also have been one of several such stashes put into place by Heinrich Himmler that we simply have no information about, the information buried somewhere in the archives yet to be examined. But it does sound like part of a plan. So perhaps Himmler was going to move, as Grothmann alleged, firstly with his small group of subordinates, in total numbering 15 men, down to the Harz Mountains and hide out for a few weeks or months until all the commotion of the initial occupation had died down. At the same time, perhaps one of his loyal subordinates would go forward in civilian clothing to the city of Plauen, make contact with local Nazi organizations there, particularly those officials who were looking after the gold, and then obtain some of this gold, or all of it, move it back into the Harz Mountains, and then, suitably disguised and carrying the correct false identification papers, Himmler's group would move down to the Alps and cross over, either into Italy or Switzerland. This is, of course, speculation on my part, but we have two important pieces of evidence. Firstly, we have Lieutenant Colonel Grothmann, who gave us the first part of the plan quite clearly. Secondly, we have the gold itself being held in a vault. Clearly this is some kind of emergency stash, and it's on the way to the Alps, which is quite convenient. Now, a special gold-hunting 75-man U.S. Army unit codenamed Task Force Fisher, commanded by U.S. Coast Guard Lieutenant Commander Joel Fisher, who was a Washington, D.C. lawyer at the U.S. Treasury Department, had been following U.S. units as they advanced through central Germany, gathering up Nazi gold and currency along the way. At Plauen, Reichsbank officials admitted that bags of gold were inside a safe in the post office basement, but said they didn't have the key. The key was on an official who had been killed in bombing, and his corpse along with the key buried under tons of rubble. Task Force Fisher received help from a combat engineer company who used explosives to blow open the secret vault. Fisher and his men discovered the following. At 1945 prices, they found 250,000 US dollars in gold coins, 1 million Swiss francs, again in gold coins, 98,450 Dutch guilders in gold coins, and 151,560 Norwegian gold krona. There was also a smaller amount of Yugoslav dinars and Hungarian currency. In total, the gold coins weighed 900 kilograms in 35 sacks and would be worth, at today's gold prices, £41,900,000, or 49.6 million US dollars. Gold coins are, of course, much easier to move around than bullion bars, and are also readily exchangeable anywhere. If we believe Werner Grothmann, and we have no reason not to, what he said does make sense. Himmler's plan clearly was to leave Germany, cross the Alps into either Italy or Switzerland. It is striking in the history books to note that many Nazi war criminals headed for Italy, where rat lines existed running down through Germany and Austria to the port of Genoa. From there, having obtained Red Cross passports and perhaps Argentinian entry visas, it was quite simple to board a ship and sail away to South America, with some others also going to the Middle East, particularly to Syria. Was this Himmler's ultimate plan? We will never know, because Himmler was of course captured by the British and died under very mysterious circumstances in their custody. The significance of the gold stash at Plauen we will never know as well, except that it most definitely belonged personally to Heinrich Himmler. But I think this theory does go some way to helping to explain what Himmler was doing travelling south, why he was prepared to undertake such a risky journey. It has all the hallmarks of the clever planning that Himmler was famous for. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and share, and also visit my audiobook channel, War Stories with Mark Felton. You can also help to support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon. Details in the description box below.